Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Koestner. I am the primary host of the Dear Katie podcast, and we are so delighted to have you take this journey with us on our weekly podcast episodes. I just want to remind everyone to do great self-care. Thriving is part of the purpose of this podcast, and we definitely want you to take a break at any time. Warm bath, fresh air, walk a dog, have a bite of chocolate, whatever you need to do good care for yourself. Just as a reintroduction, if you're not familiar with me, I am the woman who was on the cover of Time magazine at age 18 as the first in history to speak out nationally and publicly as the victim of date rape. And HBO made a film about me, and I went on to become the executive director of the Take Back the Night Foundation. We are the oldest, largest global movement on sexual violence in all forms for all people in the world. So we encourage you to visit our website for lots more information. So I'm going to turn it over to our host and our guest for today. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. This is Katie Koestner. And as I always encourage you to do self-care during every single episode as you listen, as you think it through, whatever you need to push pause, do somersaults, eat chocolate, whatever inspires you at the time. But we are continuing on our journey. And today's guest is really fascinating. I just was going over Nicole's bio, but I'm absolutely going to share a little bit about Nicole Badera. I should say Dr. Badera. So Dr. Nicole Badera is a sociologist and author of the book On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. Her research focuses broadly on how societal and social structures contribute to, social structures contribute to survivors' trauma and make sexual violence more likely to occur into the future. Her scholarship has influenced sexual violence prevention programming across the country, including for Planned Parenthood, and her work has been featured in many popular outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, Time Magazine, and Teen Vogue. Nicole puts her work into practice as an affiliated educator at the Center for Institutional Courage and is a co-founder of Beyond Compliance Consulting. My goodness. Already so accomplished, Nicole. And I know you're just really getting started with this phase of probably your life. I've got a couple decades on you, so I'm excited to hear about where you grew up and how you came into the work you're doing. So where are you from originally?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I am from Reno, Nevada. And
very cool.
Yeah, it's cool. As I was growing up, I couldn't understand why anybody would live in Reno. And now that I've left, I realize how much I took for granted.
It's so beautiful. People don't know you have like lake, you have mountains, you get to ski, you still get sunshine.
It's beautiful. I thought every lake was Lake Tahoe. I thought every lake in the world was Lake Tahoe, and I was not correct.
Lake Tahoe is a really special lake. I spoke at University of Nevada for LV Las Vegas, but also one of my earlier ones was actually in Reno when I was still a student. And the student who brought me there, Nicole, was the student government president. So he was a student and I was a student, and I was like 1 year older than the person who brought me in. It was really cool and so beautiful. And so I got to see the lake way back then.
Wow. And that's how so much of us got into that work, into all of this work, right? Is right around that same time we were college students, turning to other college students and saying, why are none of the adults in charge taking this issue seriously? We need to take matters into our own hands.
Yeah, I love that. And I know we're going to get into your book because I can't wait to hear more about it. Some of the original books, just for our listeners to think about. A book I helped write was by Andrea Parrott, who is a professor at Cornell. I was there for a little bit in between the various problems with my rapist back at William and Mary, but she wrote Rape on Campus, like the problem and the solution. Mm-hmm. And she worked there. So it was a little interesting to, think about that book. And now, for our listeners, I encourage you to read lots of things. But, and then there was another one, Peggy Reeves Sanday was at Penn at around the same time. This is back in the 90s for our listeners. and Peggy Reeves and I were on, I think it was Oprah together. And she had just written a book called Fraternity Gang Rape. So that's an interesting read too from the 90s. So these are some throwbacks, because I'm sure we're going to learn all about Nicole's new book too. So just for context.
Those are great books. And honestly, not that much has changed. Fraternity Gang Rape is one of the books that in my classes, students really resonate with the most.
Awesome.
It's one of those that you start to realize that sexual violence isn't just this occasional thing perpetrated by a couple of sociopaths. You realize that it's a social process that has to do with masculinity and inequality. And I think of a lot of her early work as really foundational for the work I'm doing now. Thinking about sexual violence as something that men commit as a way to seek privilege and to seek power.
Yeah, really well said, Nicole.
Thank you.
So you're in Reno and you go to high school there and then leave for college?
I did. I sort of stumbled into where I went to college. I was a National Merit Scholar. And so originally I came from a working class family. There was sort of an assumption that if I went to college, which very few women in my family did, but if I went to college, that I would have to get a scholarship. And so I worked really hard in school and happened to luck into a National Merit Scholarship. But otherwise, there was an assumption that I would just go to the local school. And I really wanted to go out and see something different. And I lucked into the school that I went to. I had applied mostly to these big fancy name universities, not really knowing much about how the world works. And right as application deadlines were coming up, one of my teachers who'd written letters of rec expressed some concern that I didn't have any schools that were sort of realistic for someone from my class background to go to. And, it sounds harsh, but it was also really good advice. I did get into one of the fancy schools, but I ended up applying to liberal arts colleges because at that point, they were some of the only schools that did not already have their deadlines passed. And so I applied to liberal arts colleges that offered full ride scholarships to National Merit Scholars. And that's how I ended up in Salt Lake City at Westminster College. When I visited, it just felt like a really different campus atmosphere. And it's kind of funny considering what I do now, what I was so turned off about the large universities was this fixation on men, was this fixation on sports being the most important thing and all of campus life revolving around men's activities, men's classes being in the nicer buildings while women were in the buildings that were the oldest and barely had heat that worked. And so on a liberal arts college, there's still a lot of the same issues, but it felt significantly different. And so that was a place that I was really eager to attend. Of course, once I got there, I did find a lot of the same issues you'd find on a big school's campus too.
Oh, gosh. And for those of you listening, Westminster, I know all the schools, Nicole. I think it's always good to paint a picture because Westminster is a bit of an anomaly in Utah. Mm-hmm. It is a different kind of vibe than what you might imagine as the more Latter-day Saint and Mormon community. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a little island.
Yeah. Westminster is over half out-of-state students. It's a secular campus. It was originally founded to be a stronghold against the LDS Church, and that's not the way it is now. Now it's, much more neutral religiously, but it used to be, I think, a Presbyterian school or something like that. But yeah, it is a very different vibe, and I am always kind of struck by the things that felt normal and explorable on that campus that wouldn't be somewhere else, even just like the sociology department. I majored in sociology when I was there, and our sociology department was a lot more radical than a lot of mainstream sociology departments at large universities. It's this weird little island. And I think that it's a great place if you are interested in society and how social norms work, because Utah is such a kind of outlier state. It has such a different culture than other states in the US. And so I'm not surprised that what that turns into is in some ways an open-mindedness to some other issues where you see that it's all kind of made up. That living in Nevada was so different from living in Utah. I mean, truly different in so many ways. And you realize there are a lot of different ways to have a society, and that all the things that people are telling you, they have to be this one certain way. Well, it doesn't really seem true when you have two very different experiences of two very different states.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, this is Katie Koestner, and I wanted to remind all of our listeners about the free National Sexual Assault Legal Hotline. We at Take Back the Night have assembled an incredible team of attorneys, trauma-informed, who truly believe survivors and want to support their journeys in healing and finding justice. The Get Justice Hotline is 567 Shatter, or feel free to fill out a form on the Take Back the Night website, share your story, let the attorneys know what's going on, and they will get back to you as soon as possible with all of your legal options. That is a service we are delighted to provide through Take Back the Night. So you said sociology, right?
Yep.
And then you go on, and what's after Westminster?
Well, while I was at Westminster, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And I knew I was interested in studying sexual violence or working on sexual violence in some way. And so I did two things my junior year. I started working as a rape crisis counselor in the hospitals as a victim advocate, specifically people during their forensic exams or their rape kits. A lot of people know them as that. And at the same time, I conducted my first research project, which is published, actually. And it was about how universities give tips to students about sexual assault prevention. And who are those tips for? And what are those tips telling us about the way universities think about sexual assault? And I'll say that at its core, I actually really enjoyed the victim advocacy work a lot more than the research work. I find it very difficult to witness the problem and not be able to do something about it. And so I actually like the victim advocacy work a lot more. But in that role, the survivors I met kept asking me questions that I just couldn't answer. Questions like, why did this happen? Why does it happen so often? Is it my fault? Is it his fault? Am I the only person who has a story like this one? And at the time, the state of the academic literature, it was starting to shift. But a lot of the literature that was most mainstream and most available to someone who wasn't an academic, they were saying things like, the reason sexual assault happens is because you engaged in risky behaviors. And if the victim just did something different, this wouldn't have happened. And it didn't sit right with me. And that was, for the record, not something that the Rape Crisis Center I worked at thought any of us should be saying, but we just didn't have an answer. And so I decided to go to graduate school. I started at the University of Maryland. After a couple of years, I transferred to the University of Michigan. But the goal the whole time was to answer a lot of those questions I heard as a victim advocate and to say, if we assume that sexual violence is a loss of autonomy, it's not the victim's fault, how would we answer these questions differently?
And I guess I have one kind of interesting question for you too, Nicole. How was it just through your studies and academics, or did you have a personal connection to the issue as well?
I had a lot of personal connections to the issue, and more, I talk about this at the very beginning of the book. But when I first came to the issue of sexual violence, I really thought I was coming in as an ally, as someone who thought that this was wrong, that I was friends with survivors. And to me, it felt like at the time, this kind of final frontier of feminism, sort of the last thing we have to do to make things more equitable, which I do not think is the case anymore. But at the time, I was so sure that I was doing it for other people. And then, like so many others who do a 40-hour crisis training, when you learn what the definition of sexual violence really is, when you learn that things are so different from the way they're depicted in Hollywood, when you start thinking about your lifetime experiences, you realize that, and I certainly realized that I had a lot of things that would count as crimes of loss of autonomy, that would count as sexual violence. And then I started to feel drawn to all of the harm that others had done and that I myself had done, coming from a conservative family, around betraying victims and blaming victims. And so at first I thought, this is just something that I think is really immoral and really wrong, and I want to do work here. Very quickly I realized, it's really hard to do this work in an authentic way without realizing that you do have some personal tie. Sexual violence is just that pervasive in our society.
Can you draw some more specific examples of how, what you said was beautiful, but I'm curious if you could give some specific examples of that responsibility. And, just you mentioned conservative background. So what does that mean in your operational world that we are, what's going wrong what are we doing that is helping to perpetrate sexual violence?
Well, I grew up in the 90s. And in the 90s, it was really this post-feminist moment, this idea that feminism had gone too far. And I did grow up in a conservative family. And so a lot of what I'd heard was that anybody who found themselves in these situations must have done something wrong. That if you just followed the rules of femininity and you did the right thing, that nothing like sexual violence could ever happen to you. And if it did, everybody would respond. Everybody would think it's wrong. Everybody would come to protect you as quickly as possible. And those are things that when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I absolutely repeated. I didn't think too much about them. It was what everybody around me was saying. And so I was saying it too. I started to realize that something was off once I left that conservative bubble, which is funny to think of moving to Utah as the place to leave the conservative bubble. But for me, it was. And I think as well that what conservative is in Utah is really different than it is in other places in the country. And so when I heard that same thinking and those same talking points coming from a different religious tradition, it was easier for me to think more critically about them. And so within a year or so of leaving for college, I started to rethink some of the things that I'd said in the past. And I think that some of that education was coming along before that. Something that people assume about feminist researchers is that you always thought this way, that people don't change. And the reason you're finding this stuff is because you have always been so closed-minded and you only see what you want to see. That really wasn't the case for me. It really isn't the case for most feminist researchers. Most of us come in with internalized misogyny. We have to unlearn on the way. And the depths of the harm of patriarchy is something that's shocking, I think, to most researchers. It certainly was for me at the beginning of my career. And even now, some of the stuff I saw in the book is shocking to me now. And for me, part of how that started was I actually had a Republican AP US history teacher who was so offended by some of the things I would say as a teenager about women that everybody else had to pick one classic, politically important book from some point in history to read. And I was assigned mine. And the one I was assigned was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. And so the wheels were turning before I got to college. That book really made an impression on me and it really spoke to me. But yeah, I think I would have gotten there either way, but college certainly was a big shift.
Nice. I guess one more thought I had is I don't know if you have siblings, but or if your parents are together, but what role did your parents have? And did they get upset when you changed your mindset? Were they part of that system that you thought needed changing? Was their own mindset?
Yes. Yes. I was raised partially by my parents, but I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house. My grandmother, I don't know that she would identify as a feminist, but she had a lot of values in common with feminism. And so there was always sort of a tension where I was getting some of these messages. And I think part of why I was open-minded to them was because I was spending so much time around my grandmother, who for my entire life, my grandfather died before any of us were born. And she'd been living this single woman life where she had control over her own schedule and she did what she wanted to do. And there were not men pushing her around. And then when I would go back to my parents' house, it was much more conservative. And it definitely was rocky when I was going through all of these ideological changes. They corresponded with me coming out of the closet as bisexual, and that was challenging too. My relationship with my parents is still really tough. For the most part, we don't speak. Potentially, they've come along more, funnily enough, from the book. Which I think is one of the things that's kind of amazing about writing a book is that people who, if there's a power dynamic between you and you were always in the same place and they can interrupt you, they can stop listening to you, and they never fully hear you out. It's kind of amazing how many people in my personal life have read the book, knowing that we've argued about these things in the past, knowing that it was really heated, And once they could see the entire argument from beginning to end, a lot of these stereotypes about feminists and these stereotypes about how victims really just want to hurt perpetrators, they're seeking for revenge, feminists want power over men, they've kind of stripped away in a way that I didn't expect. And my parents' reaction to the book has actually been really surprising.
Oh, maybe they'll rethink.
I hope so.
You never know, right?
I hope so. I'm trying to be open to it.
Hi, everybody. It's Katie Koestner. Just a quick interruption. We want you to know that there is an entire shop full of cool merch on the Take Back the Night website to support your own healing journey, that of someone you care about. There are t-shirts, there's bracelets, there's glow-in-the-dark stuff. There's all kinds of unique special edition from our artist series as well. So please take a look. If it's a holiday or a special occasion or just a gift to yourself, support Take Back the Night through your purchase. Well, let's talk about how you did the research and what's in the book and what did you learn writing it?
Yeah, so to do the research, I really wanted my own look inside the way universities manage sexual violence. Research-wise, it's where I've been focused most of my career, but I felt like I kind of stumbled into college sexual violence work just because it was close, because so much of my personal transformation came from college, and that's where I was learning so much about sexual violence and these tensions between what schools were saying and what they really meant and what their values really were. It just seemed like a place I kept getting drawn back to. And then around that same time, the first time I did research on this topic was the summer of 2013, which is the same summer that the Obama administration put out new guidelines and they called a White House task force to try to get schools to do better. And so it's been in the news for the past decade, and it's been really contentious for the past decade, but hardly anybody has seen inside what schools are doing. We've had to take on faith that they're doing what they say. And then we've had really contrasting narratives from victims who have been through the Title IX process and from perpetrators who say that they were unfairly treated. And so I wanted to see for myself what was going on. I wanted to interview everybody. And so I found one university that let me do ethnographic research. That's where you just kind of hang out and talk to people and witness things for yourself. I got to do that for a little over a year. And I also interviewed everybody involved in the process: victims, perpetrators, school administrators who worked with them, and school administrators who never met them but had a lot of power. People who work in the general counsel's office, people who are upper level administrators and control budget, things like that. And once I got inside and could see an entire year of Title IX cases for myself, I was really shocked. Like I was saying before, I was really shocked by how much worse things are on college campuses than I thought. And in some ways, I don't think this book has anything new in it. Survivors have been telling us their stories of being dismissed or betrayed by their schools for decades. But at the same time, one of the things I was most surprised by is that there'd been this expectation when I went into the field that the reason I needed to interview the perpetrators and the administrators was because survivors were not reliable narrators. There was an expectation from other academics, for example, that if I only interviewed survivors, I'd be getting one side of the story. It would be a biased side, and it would paint the survivors in the best possible light and the institution in the worst possible light. And I actually found the opposite. I found that the stories we've been hearing from survivors, while we could have taken action on them a long time ago, the survivors often gave much more generous accounts to their schools and to their perpetrators than what had actually happened. And when I interviewed the school administrators in a way that I could fact check some of what they were saying, when they knew I had seen it for myself, so maybe they spoke a little bit more candidly, I was stunned by just how much the school was focused on protecting perpetrators, especially the ones that they valued. And the bar for what was considered to be a valuable perpetrator was pretty low. But the bar to be a valuable victim was unbelievably high. And that's what the book is about.
Let's define what valuable is then. What characteristics were they identifying?
Well, when I think about value, I was thinking about who the school really wanted to keep in school. Who did they think was so important that they would be heartbroken if they left? And who was the school willing to mobilize resources for to make sure that they stayed? And where I would see the lack of value given to survivors would be when there's a story I tell at the beginning of the book that I think is a really good example of this. And it's a really common scenario. There is a victim. Her pseudonym in the book is Bree. She comes into her class on the first day and sees that her perpetrator is sitting among the rows of other students. And it's a class in the African American Studies department, and the material covers sexual violence. And so at first she tries to stick it out, but because the subject matter itself includes discussions of sexual assault, it gets too hard. It's feeling very re-traumatizing, extremely distressing. It's interfering in her other classes. She's getting really stressed about going to class. And so she goes to the school and asks for help. And what they tell her is that there is no process available to remove her perpetrator from that class this semester. That maybe she could file an investigation, she could open an investigation, and maybe, if it ended in her favor, they might remove him from campus entirely, but there's no way that'll be done early enough to take care of this class. So instead, they suggest that if she can't handle it, she should drop the class. And this is a moment where I could just see the value of the two different students really clearly. The perpetrator's space in that class is considered to be non-negotiable. The institution literally doesn't even have a way to remove him from class, even though they're legally allowed to. I'll say that really clearly. Legally, they would be allowed to do so if they wanted. But the victim, her education is not seen as very important. And she's seen as someone who should be flexible. It's really her problem existing in her head. If she's strong enough and tough enough, she should be able to put up with it, even though that's not how trauma works. And so there's the sense that she's, for lack of a better word, she's damaged in some way. And she's no longer a valuable student because of the violence she's endured. And one of the things that was really striking to me is that when the gender roles were reversed, and when it was men, regardless of their role in the process, whether they were filing complaints or they were named in complaints as perpetrators, the school was not nearly as reluctant to step in. This reluctance to step in really came when it was women or other gender marginalized people asking for protection. That's where I saw the value. It really came down to a gendered value. And I want to say, too, it was mostly presumed. In this case, Bree never named her perpetrator. The school didn't know who he was. They didn't know any characteristics about him. He was presumed valuable, while she was presumed to be less valuable, to be disposable, to be someone who could be pushed around. And so it's kind of a hard question to answer, to say, what is it that they're valuing? Because a lot of the time, this is one of the big findings of the book, most of the time, these Title IX cases are about perpetrators and about their violence, but most of the time, the perpetrators are never involved. The school either doesn't know who they are, or the process falls apart well before they would really be involved, and so they're not involved. And the school, since they don't know who they are, and they're so accustomed to trying to shut these things down early, the perpetrators don't have to have individual valuable characteristics to be valued. And that's how we can see the gender inequality. That's how we can see this sort of social, societal level inequality taking place, is these men haven't had to do anything to earn this value. They're just valued.
So I guess just to summarize, you're saying that you found that the gender itself was the value.
Yeah. The gender itself was the value. There was a real sense from my interviews with administrators that their work was to protect the futures of promising young men, while women were never considered to be worthy of that kind of protection. And I'll say that there was another version of that too, that you don't see as much in the book because it's mostly focused on students. But when the perpetrator was a professor, then they saw their work as protecting that professor's legacy. And that in that case, they would never get another chance. So it was even more important to protect them. And this is really the opposite of how I think the average person would hope a school would respond to issues of sexual violence. This assumption that the perpetrator deserves protection, no matter whether or not the school believes they have committed acts of violence. And that's another thing that's in the book, is that in a lot of these cases, the school did believe the victims. The school knew that sexual violence had occurred. There was plenty of evidence to be certain about it. And even in those cases, the school still hesitated to do anything to protect a survivor's education that would inconvenience the perpetrator in any way.
And you didn't find any more extreme, I would say, favoritism if someone was, a full paying tuition student or a star athlete, or I don't know if you had enough of a sample to look at those as well. Because it was just to confirm, it was this one institution that gave you access to the cases.
It was one institution, but I think a lot of people expect that there's more favoritism when a perpetrator is particularly privileged. And I think that would be the case. But as it stands, we have research now that tells us that the average university expels one student every 3 years for sexual assault. It is such a rarity that all perpetrators are benefiting from this focus on protecting the donors, the football players, whoever else is considered to be the most valuable. All men who are accused are benefiting from that, because the way that the protection actually works is the Title IX system doesn't really produce any form of accountability. And if it doesn't work to protect survivors at all, if it doesn't work to discipline perpetrators at all, that's the most reliable protection for those most high value perpetrators. And so that's what it looks like. And I'll say that even that number, that 1 in 3 number, or one expulsion every 3 years number for perpetrators, that number is falling. Under the Trump administration, a lot of even large public universities went back to the way things were 10 years ago, where they're investigating 0 cases of sexual assault per year. And so in that case, we're getting back down to having 0 perpetrators held accountable for cases of sexual violence.
And just quickly, Nicole, where did that number come from? The 1 every 3 years?
It comes from a study that the primary author is Tara Richards. And what they did is they looked at publicly available case outcome data in the state of New York. There are 2 states in the country where universities have to report the way they manage Title IX, and that's New York and Maryland. And there's been research on the outcomes of their cases in both of those contexts, in New York and in Maryland. And so this one was focused on New York. It's worth noting, so the school that I studied, I was in a conservative state. I was in a blue dot in a red state, like so many of our students. And some people have said, well, do you think that it's just this school that's particularly bad? But it's worth noting that the research that we do have that is so damning, that is so concerning, is coming out of New York. And New York, in many ways, has been considered to be a leader on Title IX policy. It was one of the first states to pass an affirmative consent policy statewide for all New York state institutions. And so when we are seeing those numbers coming from the state of New York, it's especially alarming.
That is fascinating, Nicole. And I'm glad so we have Tara's work came from 2 states and yours came from this one university so far. I would love to hear any other highlights for our listeners to look for, should they have the good fortune to pick up your book. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for continuing to take the journey on the Dear Survivor podcast. A quick note, we are 100% volunteer at the podcast and at Take Back the Night. Your donations, your generosity helps us do what we do on such a shoestring budget. And we would be so grateful if this show is helping you through your journey and you are passing it along to others you care about. Please visit the Take Back the Night website and donate and support our cause and our mission to end sexual violence and support survivors. Thank you. And then I wanted to hear a few more of those ideas, and then maybe what's next. I mean, you're currently teaching, correct?
No, actually, I'm not teaching anymore.
Okay.
Let me plug one more thing. So if people are wondering about their own school. The other place we've got some really good reporting about how schools are handling Title IX is through USA Today. A reporter named Kenneth Jacoby put in public records requests for all of the public flagship universities' data on Title IX. And a lot of them complied, not all. But if you are at a public flagship university, or your child is, and you want to see how they're doing and how often perpetrators are being suspended and expelled, you can look that up. It's in a publicly available article in USA Today.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that too, Nicole. Yeah. I appreciate it. So what other highlights from your most recent book should we pay attention to?
I think one of the biggest highlights for me, one of the things that I think is most important to understand for survivors, and I hope is validating for survivors and also for the survivors in our lives, because for all of us, regardless of the violence we've experienced, we also are the ally some of the time too. And one of the things that I found that I don't know that I've seen captured quite the same way is the way survivors' lives would really unwind following a sexual assault and trying to seek resources from their schools. And so much of why that happened is because universities are so much more than schools. We tend to talk about them as just these educational spaces. But for a lot of the survivors in the study, their entire life was on campus. And so if they were pressured to withdraw from school or take a leave of absence and come back when they're healed, which is something that national studies tell us about a third of survivors that report will hear. If they did take their school up on that and they said, you know what, I'm going to take a break for a while, a lot of them didn't realize just what that would mean for the stability in their lives. They would often lose their housing immediately. They would not get a refund if they were living on campus. They would lose their meal plan. They would not get a refund. They would lose their health care. And we know how hard it is to get new healthcare unexpectedly in the United States. They would find that since they were off campus now, they had to start paying back their student loans. And they didn't have that job with a college degree that they thought they would have when they had to pay off their student loans. And if they went behind on their student loans, if they couldn't keep up and pay them, then they wouldn't be able to come back to school because they couldn't get more student loans to support that education. For a lot of survivors, this is the way that their intention to step aside for a semester or maybe half a semester and come back very, very soon can derail their educations altogether, and they don't get the degrees that they sought out to get. I was really struck by the amount of housing instability and financial precarity that a lot of the survivors were experiencing. And I think that's especially visible because most of the other books on college sexual assault have been conducted at Ivy League universities. And in that setting, students can really count on their parents to be that safety net, that if they leave school, they have a place to land. But the school that I call Western University was a large public university, mostly attended by in-state students who did not apply to go anywhere else because this is where everybody would go. This is the place for students in this community. And so in those cases, they didn't necessarily have parents who could just foot the bill for everything that might come up. And I think that that's something that we haven't really reckoned with almost at all around campus sexual violence, is the impact is not just about your grades, which it will have an impact on a survivor's grades, but it's so much else, and it can totally change the trajectory of survivors' lives. Some of this isn't from my book, but in doing the literature review to prepare to write this book, one of the things I was most struck by is how often sexual assault survivors will change their majors. And a lot of that has to do with discrimination and difficulty completing coursework and a lack of flexibility from faculty who blame the victim instead of recognizing that they're up against something hard. And I know this sounds like a lot and it sounds really overwhelming. And I will say the book has been out for about a month now. And one of the things I hear most often from survivors who've been through it is that it's a big weight off their shoulders. It is validating to know that a lot of the ways that their life unwound around their sexual assault, they had blamed themselves. They thought they just weren't handling things well, or they thought they were totally disconnected. And to see that that happens to so many people really made it easier to forgive themselves for something that was never their fault, and to think more about, okay, if this is part of what happened to me, what do I want to do next? How do I want to do things a little bit differently? And how can I support other people who are going through this so their entire life doesn't unwind too?
Super work, Nicole. I'm so proud of how detailed and in depth you went with the access to all the records you had. And I certainly sit alongside you in that I was trying to do that from campus to campus, but I didn't have access to the hard records. I had access to all the survivors who would show up at my speeches and they would give me their narratives, as I was finishing, there would be a long line. So I love that you took the initiative to really document everything that you could find and read. And I absolutely hope that our listeners will pick up a copy and read more about how they're definitely not alone. And this is a hard system to find justice in. are you planning to do another piece? Like what are you working on next?
I am. Right now, I'm working on two main things. One is, like I said at the beginning of our conversation, I have always found it really hard to be the researcher sitting across the table from somebody telling me some of the hardest things in their life and to not do anything. And I feel like I have a debt to pay after hearing so many of these stories. So I opened an anti-violence consulting firm. One of the things that I found during the work is that a lot of people who enter anti-violence roles on college campuses or anywhere, or an anti-violence role finds them, they do a totally different job, and now there is violence in their workplace and they have no idea what to do. But they need the help of experts. And a lot of the consulting firms and expert spaces that are available now are really focused on meeting the bare minimum of being compliant with the law. They don't want to end sexual violence. They just want to make it a little more tolerable or look a little bit better within their organization. And I have a little hope that if there's an expert who can actually help people focus on ending sexual violence, creating a space where violence isn't tolerated, which we know those are the spaces where it won't occur in the future, that we might be able to do some good. And so we've been working with people from organizations, all different kinds of organizations, not just universities. Universities are these like little mini communities. And so we actually have a lot of experience thinking about employment law and all kinds of other things. So we've been doing that kind of stuff for a little over a year now, and it's been wonderful and amazing. And if anybody hearing this thinks that that might be helpful, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then the other thing that I'm working on is a second book. I would like to write basically sort of the takeaways from this book in terms of what accountability would look like if we removed the burdens of sexual violence from the shoulders of survivors and instead put those burdens where they belong, which is on the perpetrator. And that's kind of a theme that comes through the book, is that sexual violence has some unavoidable consequences. Things like the victim and perpetrator can never safely share space again. And even if victims can endure it and they'll put themselves through it, it's still not fair and it's still not easy and it is often still damaging. And so I wanted to write a book to really think about what the solutions would look like, both for what we will do as individuals, because we know that there aren't a lot of structures we can trust to address these issues correctly in society. But also, I want to think towards that structural change as well. And when we're in positions of power in organizations that matter, what can we do to be the person who's helping a survivor instead of compounding their trauma? So I'm really excited about that project. And I'm hoping to have a manuscript together within the next year. We'll see.
That is fantastic, Nicole. You shared so much in such a good, dense interview, and I really applaud you. You're going onward and upward with the work you're doing. It's so important to expose what is being either covered up or ignored. And I feel like you are definitely paying it forward with the work you're doing. So thank you for being on the podcast. And we will absolutely put show notes and links to your website and book. And for all of our listeners, together we thrive, we survive, and we stay on this journey together. Every guest brings a new way of thinking about our healing journeys. So please stay with us. And if, Nicole's interview was inspirational in the sense that you also want to seek justice, please do not hesitate to reach out. Use our hotline on Take Back the Night for the Shatter the Silence sexual assault legal hotline. And you can also fill out the form there. There's tons of resources for survivors and supporters from all paths in life. So you will find, I think, something for everyone out there with all your different journeys and experiences. So thank you. And again, stay tuned for our next episode that will drop. Usually we drop one a week. So keep on the journey with us. Take care. Thank you again, everybody, for joining another episode of the Dear Katie podcast. I hope very much you found today's episode helpful, empowering, and a way to take another step in that long journey toward healing and supporting those we care about, learning about sexual violence prevention, and also survivor support. For those of you who don't know, again, the Take Back the Night website has tons of great resources, books, self-care options, cool merch. If you're feeling like you need a wearable, we have great t-shirts. Of course, we would love it if you follow along on our free newsletter with news and events going on around the country and even around the globe. And finally, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find our entire community popping up here and there, and recaps of our podcast episodes as well. So together we shatter the silence, and together we end the violence. Take care.